The Bellini Gala was a masterclass in choreographed desire. Amidst the soaring marble columns and the heavy scent of expensive lilies, the air hummed with a specific kind of electricity that only followed Dante Greco. He moved through the crowd like a dark current, a man of sharp lines and tailored shadows. Conversations didn't just stop when he passed, they bent, shifting their tone to accommodate his gravity. Beautiful women, draped in silk and shimmering gems, tracked his movement with hungry, unpermitted eyes. They were used to his reputation, a man who took what he wanted and discarded it just as easily, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and bruised egos. Dante was accustomed to being the center of the orbit. He spent his nights navigating a sea of available bodies and desperate social climbers, his knuckles often still humming from the violence of his day job, and his bed rarely empty. But tonight, the predictable glamour felt like a stifling weight. Then he saw her. Nia wasn't part of the dance. She was a ghost in a black uniform, moving with a grounded, effortless allure that had nothing to do with the luxury surrounding her. She hadn't spared him a single glance. While every other woman in the room was a loud plea for attention, Nia was a silent, curved silhouette of indifference. The intrigue was a sharp, sudden heat in his blood. Dante stepped into her path, his presence a wall of dominant Italian masculinity. He didn't ask. He didn't charm. He simply leaned in, the faint scent of tobacco and citrus clinging to him, and whispered a command that usually ended in total submission. "Be ready when your shift ends. My driver will be at the side entrance." The surrounding air seemed to freeze. A group of socialites nearby paused mid-laugh, their expressions tightening with a mix of shock and visceral jealousy. They were used to being chosen, yet here was the king of the underworld selecting a girl who hadn't even looked his way. Nia stopped. She looked up at him, her gaze steady and unreadable. She didn't shrink away from the ink crawling up his neck or the predatory intensity in his eyes. She looked at him the way one looks at a door left slightly ajar, not afraid of the dark room behind it, but merely noting that it was open. "No," she said. The word was quiet, yet it echoed louder than a gunshot against the marble. A champagne glass held by a woman in a shimmering red gown paused halfway to her mouth. The confusion in the room was palpable. It was as if she had broken a fundamental law of physics. She wasn't playing hard to get. She wasn't even trying. Dante didn't move. He didn't threaten. He just stood there for 3 full seconds, the longest he had been still in years, searching her face for a crack, a tremor, or a hint of a game. He found only a calm, terrifying stillness. Without a word, he turned and walked away. It wasn't an exit. It was a retreat to regroup. The hunt had changed, and for the first time, the predator was the one who felt unsettled. The cool night air of the city didn't wash away the scent of the gala. It only carried the lingering, heavy perfume of a woman who had slipped into the back seat of his car without an invitation. Dante didn't stop her. He didn't even look at her. He simply stared out the window at the passing blur of Manhattan, his mind a theater playing a 3-second loop of a waitress's eyes. He allowed her presence the way he allowed the leather seats beneath him, a familiar, expected comfort that required nothing of his soul. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, overlooking a city that glowed like a bed of embers. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of silk hitting the floor. The woman moved with a practiced, elegant ease, her touch light and rhythmic against the tattoos on his chest. She knew the script. She knew when to lean in, when to pull back, and exactly how to stroke the ego of a man who held the world in his blood-stained palms. Dante responded with the mechanical precision of a man who had read these lines 1,000 times before. He moved, he touched, he took, performing the rites of a life lived in excess. But somewhere in the middle of the orchestrated heat, the rhythm faltered. He leaned back, his breath hitching, and for a heartbeat, the space behind his eyes went empty. He reached for a name to anchor the moment, a word to ground the woman in his arms, but it was gone, dissolved into the expensive shadows of the room. He didn't know who she was. She was a blur of blonde hair and expensive taste, a placeholder in a bed that had seen dozens just like her. What came instead was a memory of uncomfortable, piercing clarity. He didn't see the woman beneath him. Instead, he saw the flickering light of the gala's chandeliers reflecting off a silver tray. He saw the way the champagne hadn't even shivered in its glass. He remembered the exact, terrifying steadiness of Nia's hand, a hand that hadn't trembled when he threatened her world with his mere presence. He felt the weight of her no all over again, a cold stone in his gut that no amount of practiced warmth could melt. The detachment he usually wore like armor felt suddenly thin. He had built an empire on the ability to categorize people as assets or obstacles, but Nia Bennett refused to be shelved. The woman in his bed was willing, she was beautiful, and she was entirely forgettable. The woman in the black uniform was gone, she was defiant, and she was the only thing he could truly see. Dante closed his eyes, but the image of the unshaken Trey remained, burned into the back of his eyelids like a brand. It had never happened before, the world of his habits failing to drown out the reality of a single, quiet girl. The night continued, but the script was broken. The blue light of the tablet screen was the only thing cutting through the dim interior of Dante's office. It illuminated the sharp, restless angles of his face as he scrolled through a life reduced to black text on a white background. Nia Bennett, 26. She didn't exist in the digital noise of the city. No filtered photos, no curated status updates, no breadcrumbs left for a man like him to follow. She was a ghost living in plain sight. 3 jobs, Marco said, his voice grating against the silence as he leaned against the mahogany desk. Gala catering, a laundry service in Queens, and 6 nights a week at a 24-hour diner called the Silver Spoon. She's a machine, Dante. Dante didn't look up. He was staring at the name of her brother, Leo. 8 months of escalating debt to the Lucchesi family. High interest, low hope. Most people in that position would have used a moment with Dante Greco to beg, to bargain, or to barter a smile for a lifeline. Nia had done the opposite. He was looking for the angle, the strategy, the hidden play that explained why she had treated the most dangerous man in the room like an inconvenience. "I'm looking for the reason, Marco," Dante murmured, his thumb pausing over a scanned document. "Nobody says no without a price in mind. She's either working for someone else, or she's waiting for me to raise the stakes." "Maybe," Marco replied, flipping a page in the physical folder. "Or maybe she just doesn't want anything from you, boss." The sentence hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Dante dismissed him with a sharp flick of his wrist, but the words refused to leave the room. He turned back to the file, his eyes catching a brief, clinical footnote about her mother, Elena Bennett. It mentioned a history of instability, a volatile relationship with a high-profile figure that had ended in a quiet, devastating collapse. It was a cold account, stripped of any real detail, and Dante read it with the detached interest of a man checking a bank statement. He didn't see the warning signs, he only saw a background check. He closed the file, the sound of the paper hitting the desk like a gavel. He thought of the way she had stood her ground at the gala, the way her hand hadn't moved even as the world around her held its breath. She wasn't playing a game. She was surviving something he didn't yet understand. He reached for his coat, the silk lining sliding over his tattooed skin. He didn't need the files anymore. He needed to see the girl who had looked at a king and seen nothing worth her time. "The Silver Spoon," Dante muttered to the empty room. He wanted to see if the stillness held when the marble floors were replaced by linoleum and the champagne was replaced by cheap coffee. He wanted to see what it looked like when a woman had absolutely nothing to gain from him. The neon sign of the Silver Spoon hummed with a tired, rhythmic buzz, casting a flickering pink glow over the wet pavement outside. Inside, the air smelled of burnt grease and industrial cleaner, a sharp departure from the expensive sandalwood and aged scotch of Dante's world. He parked the black sedan at a crooked angle, his presence an immediate stain of luxury against the gravel lot. When he pushed through the door, the bell gave a tinny chime that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Dante didn't wait to be seated. He moved with the effortless arrogance of a man who owned every floor he stepped on, sliding onto the last open stool at the linoleum counter. He was too sharp for the room, his tailored suit and the ink crawling up his neck making him look like a predator who had wandered into a domestic sanctuary. Nia saw him. It was a subtle shift, a tightening of her shoulders, a momentary pause in her stride, but then that terrifying stillness returned. She picked up a notepad with a hand that remained impossibly steady and walked toward him. She didn't offer a smile or a look of recognition. "What can I get you?" Her voice was flat, professional, and entirely unimpressed. "Coffee. Black." He tried conversation, casting low-frequency provocations designed to rattle her cage, but she responded as if he were any other man ordering a drink. She was a master of the mundane, stripping him of his status with every refill. At one point, the tension peaked when Dante reached past her for a napkin dispenser. He stepped just slightly behind the counter, entering her space with a calculated lack of permission. He was too close, not touching, but near enough that the air between them grew thin. He could feel the sudden shift in her breathing, a shallow, sharp hitch that betrayed the effort of her composure. He didn't move, lingering in the heat of her personal perimeter, testing the gravity of her no. Nia didn't flinch. She didn't pull back. She simply waited, then stepped away first, not quickly, not nervously, but with a deliberate, slow movement that reclaimed her control. Every woman Dante had ever touched had eventually leaned in, drawn to the danger or the power he radiated. This one moved around him. She treated his presence like a physical obstacle, an item to be navigated rather than a man to be seduced. He stood to leave, laying $100 bill beside the untouched coffee. Nia swept it up and dropped it into the communal tip jar by the register without a second glance. "You know," he remarked dryly, pausing with his hand on the door, "most people at least check the denomination before they throw it away." For the briefest of seconds, the corner of Nia's mouth twitched, the ghost of a real, unperformed smile at the sheer absurdity of his ego. She turned away before he could capture it, but it was too late. He had seen it. It was a small, genuine crack in the armor, and it landed harder than any submission he had ever forced. He walked out into the rain, the memory of that half-smile burning brighter than the neon light behind him. The data on the Lucchesi debt was far worse than the clinical lines in the file suggested. Leo Bennett hadn't just borrowed capital, he had bartered information he didn't possess, promising the Lucchesis access to shipping manifests that were never his to give. He was a boy drowning in a sea of sharks, and the sharks were tired of waiting. In Dante's world, that kind of debt was usually settled in blood or permanent servitude. Yet, as Dante pulled his car to the curb across from the diner 2 nights later, it wasn't the brother's recklessness that held his attention. It was the sister's silence. He didn't get out of the car. Instead, he watched through the rain-streaked window of the Silver Spoon as Nia handled a table of 3 intoxicated men. They were loud, their gestures invasive, one of them catching her wrist as she tried to set down a plate. Dante's hand tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, a primal urge to tear the door off its hinges surging through him. But he watched her. Nia didn't scream. She didn't even pull away with force. She simply went stone still, that same absolute vacuum of emotion he had seen at the gala. She spoke a few quiet words, her face a mask of professional indifference, until the man laughed and let go. Only when she turned toward the kitchen did Dante see the slight tightening in her jaw, the way her shoulders held a tension so high it looked like it might snap her spine. He finally understood. This wasn't indifference. This was a masterclass in survival. Her stillness wasn't a lack of fear. It was a cage she had built to keep the fear from consuming her. She wasn't unbothered. She was holding a shattered version of herself together with nothing but sheer, exhausting will. She couldn't afford the luxury of a reaction because reactions led to cracks, and cracks were where men like the Lucchesis, or men like Dante, found their way in. He looked at the small, tired woman through the glass and realized that every minute of her calm was a battle fought in the dark. He felt a sudden, visceral shame at his own previous desire to rattle her, to break that composure just to prove he could. He didn't go in that night. He couldn't bring himself to add his shadow to her burden when she was already carrying the weight of the world. He simply sat in the darkness of his car, watching her move with that devastating precision, until the rain finally obscured the view. When he drove away, he wasn't thinking about his own desire anymore. He was thinking about how much it cost a human being to be that still. The lighting in the penthouse of the St. Regis was a soft, amber hue, designed to blur the edges of reality and make everything feel like a dream bought with a high-limit credit card. Outside, the city was a silent tapestry of light, but inside, the silence was expensive and heavy. Dante sat on the edge of the plush velvet sofa, a glass of crystal-clear gin in his hand. Across from him, a woman whose name had been a whisper of perfume earlier that evening was leaning in. She was beautiful in the way women in his world were supposed to be, polished, articulate, and radiating a warmth that felt like a well-rehearsed performance. She was telling a story, something light and witty about a gallery opening, and she laughed at a dry observation he'd made minutes ago, one he hadn't intended to be funny. Dante watched her. He watched the way her throat moved when she laughed, the way she touched his forearm to bridge the distance, and the way she looked at him with an invitation that was as clear as the glass in his hand. It should have worked. This was the script he had lived by for 15 years. This was the easy part of being Dante Greco, the disposable nights where power was a pheromone and every interaction was a transaction of pleasure. But he wasn't there. Mentally, he was standing on a cracked linoleum floor, smelling burnt coffee and industrial soap. He was back in that 3-second silence at the gala, staring into a pair of eyes that didn't want a single thing he had to offer. The woman laughed again, a bright, melodic sound, and Dante felt a sudden, visceral surge of irritation. It wasn't because of her. It was because the sound felt thin. It lacked the weight of the silence he had encountered at the diner. He found himself dissecting the moment, trying to understand why her warmth felt like a drafty room, and why her closeness felt like an intrusion. He set his glass down on the marble coaster with a decisive click. "I have an early meeting," he said, his voice flat and final. He didn't do it cruelly. He didn't do it kindly. He simply ended it, the way a person closes a book they've realized they've already read. He watched the confusion flicker across her face, the shock of a woman used to being the finale, now relegated to an intermission. He offered a polite, empty apology and saw himself out. It was only when he was standing in the elevator, watching the floor numbers count down in a sterile digital glow, that the realization hit him. It was a cold, jagged thought that he didn't want to own. It wasn't that the woman in the room was lacking. She was perfect by every standard he had ever held. The problem was that she wasn't Nia. She didn't have that terrifying stillness. She didn't have the no that lived in her marrow. And for the first time in his life, Dante Greco realized that a yes he could buy was worth infinitely less than the one woman who refused to sell. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. In the back of a blacked-out SUV, Dante signed away a sum that would have taken Nia 15 years of double shifts to accumulate. He did it with the clinical detachment of a man paying a parking ticket, watching the Lucchesi captain's eyes flicker with a mix of greed and confusion. To Dante, it was a simple equation. Remove the debt, remove the danger, and the woman would finally have a reason to look at him without a wall in her eyes. He waited for her at the back exit of the diner, the morning air gray and biting. When Nia emerged, her movements heavy with the leaden exhaustion of the sunrise shift, he stepped into the light and held out a single piece of paper. The receipt of the wire transfer. The death of Leo's debt. "It's over," Dante said, his voice carrying the quiet triumph of a provider. "The Lucchesis are paid in full. Consider it a gift." Nia didn't take the paper. She stood perfectly still, the wind whipping a loose strand of hair across her face, her eyes scanning the document as if it were a death warrant. The silence stretched until the air felt thin, the distance between them growing with every heartbeat. "Did you ask me first?" she asked. The question was a whisper, but it cut through the hum of the city like a blade. Dante frowned, the first stirrings of irritation prickling his skin. "I saved your brother's life, Nia. I saved yours. Does the sequence matter?" "It matters," she said, finally meeting his gaze. Her fury wasn't loud. It was a cold, precise thing that made her seem taller, more immovable. "I have spent every waking second of the last 8 months earning my own freedom. I was paying that debt on my terms, with my sweat. And you just took that from me. You didn't give me a gift, Dante. You bought a piece of my life, so you could feel like you own the rest of it. You think because you have the money, you get to decide what I owe." She didn't wait for an answer. She dismantled him with a look that stripped away his tailored suit and his violent reputation, leaving only a man who had tried to buy something that wasn't for sale. "The fact that you can pay it doesn't mean you have the right to. You didn't solve a problem, you just changed who's holding the leash." She stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his in a way that felt like a permanent dismissal. Dante stood alone in the alley, the paper crumpling in his fist. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even the beginning of a yes. Instead, he was left with the realization that he had committed the ultimate sin in Nia's world. He had tried to take her choice. He watched her walk away until she disappeared into the morning fog, leaving him with a debt of his own that money couldn't touch. The penthouse was cold, the kind of expensive chill that no amount of climate control could fix. Dante didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to see the woman waiting in the oversized bed, a silhouette of lace and expectation. He moved through the shadows with a sharper edge than usual, his movements stripped of the slow, predatory grace that usually defined him. Tonight, he wasn't looking for a script. He was looking for a distraction, a way to overwrite the memory of Nia's voice telling him he was nothing more than a better-tailored version of her nightmares. He was less patient than he had ever been. He took what was offered without the pretense of a slow burn, his touch heavy and demanding. He directed the night with a clinical, iron-fisted authority, reclaiming the physical world he understood so well. He finished, the act as brief and efficient as a business transaction, and waited for the familiar surge of satisfaction to hit his bloodstream. It never came. Instead, there was only a hollow, echoing nothing. No relief. No reclamation of power. Just a mounting, jagged irritation that clawed at the back of his throat. He sat on the edge of the bed, the city's lights shimmering through the glass like a taunt. He had done everything right according to the rules of his life, yet he felt more out of control than he had in the alley behind the diner. The frustration began to curdle, turning into something darker and far more calculated. He realized that the woman in his bed, like every other woman before her, was a variable he had already solved. Nia Bennett was the only equation that refused to balance, and the more he tried to force it, the more he felt himself slipping. If he couldn't own her gratitude, he would own her reality. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, his thumb hovering over Marco's name. He told himself it wasn't a threat. He told himself it was a strategic necessity to keep the Lucchese's from circling back. But as he typed the message, ordering the quiet signal to be sent out that Leo Bennett was now under the Greco shadow, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was placing a mark on her life that she couldn't wipe away. It was ownership without the word, a collar forged from the very safety she had fought to earn on her own. He didn't need her to say yes anymore. He just needed her to be unable to walk away. Dante stood up and walked to the window, watching the sunrise bleed across the horizon. He felt a grim, cold settling in his chest. He had reclaimed his control, but as he stared out at the city, he realized he had finally become the one thing Nia feared most. He didn't care. The stillness was gone, replaced by the weight of a chain he had just finished welding. The silence Nia Bennett projected was not the loud, crashing anger Dante was accustomed to. It wasn't a slammed door or a shouted accusation. It was something far more surgical, a total removal of his existence from her perimeter. When Dante entered the Silver Spoon the following night, the air didn't crackle with the tension of their previous encounters. Instead, it felt hollow. Nia saw in the moment the bell chimed, but her eyes didn't linger. There was no tightening of her jaw, no flare of defiance. She simply turned her back and spoke to a younger waitress, handing over a carafe of coffee with a mechanical grace. For the next hour, Dante sat at the counter, a ghost in a high-priced suit. A girl named Chloe served him, her hands shaking slightly as she avoided his gaze, but Nia remained a distant orbit. She moved through the diner with a focused, clinical efficiency, refilling sugars and wiping tables, as if Dante were just another piece of the furniture she had to work around. He watched her, waiting for the moment her eyes would slip, waiting for the flicker of the woman who had almost smiled at him. It never came. He had been ignored by enemies before, and he had been shunned by women playing games of peek, but he had never been erased. This was the silence of a woman who had already mourned the person he was and decided that the space he occupied was better left empty. For the first time in his life, Dante didn't reach for his phone to call a distraction. He didn't seek out the familiar warmth of a willing body or the shallow validation of his own power. He sat with the weight of the silence he had manufactured, realizing that by branding her brother with his shadow, he had turned himself into the one thing she could never allow herself to see. He had wanted to be her protector. He had ended up as her prison guard. The realization sat like lead in his chest, a dull ache that no amount of scotch or violence could numb. It was a new kind of defeat, one that didn't come with a body count. But while Dante sat in the wreckage of his ego, other eyes were beginning to narrow. In the dimly lit backrooms of the Lucchese territory, the anomaly of Leo Bennett's sudden, unearned immunity was being picked apart. The Lucchese's didn't believe in coincidences, and they certainly didn't believe in the sudden charity of a Greco boss. They traced the thread back from Leo, through the paid debts and the whispered warnings, until it led them directly to the quiet girl in the black uniform. They didn't know yet why Dante had broken his own rules for her, but they knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had found his pulse. The information didn't come from a wiretap or a whispered confession in a dark alley. It came from a nervous delivery driver named Sal, who had been dropping off crates at the diner for 3 years, and whose brother ran a gambling den in Lucchese territory. He didn't look Nia in the eye when he told her that people were asking questions, specifically about the waitress who had the Greco boss wrapped around her finger. Nia didn't drop the plate she was holding. She didn't even blink. She just thanked Sal, tucked a stray curl behind her ear, and went into the back break room. She didn't call Dante. To Nia, Dante was the reason the fire had started. He was the last person she would ask to help put it out. Instead, she called her cousin Vera in upstate New York. The conversation was brief, coded, and final. By the time she hung up, she had already initiated a transfer from the savings account she had guarded like a religious relic for 2 years. Leo would be on a bus by dawn. She was dismantling her own life with the surgical precision of someone who had practiced for this since she was 16. She was efficient. She was quiet. And most importantly, she was entirely alone. When her phone vibrated on the stainless steel prep table with Dante's name, she didn't even look at the screen. She let it buzz until the silence returned, then slid it into her pocket. She had no use for his shadow anymore. 30 minutes later, the familiar black sedan pulled into the gravel lot, the headlights cutting through the diner's steam-fogged windows. Dante entered with a kinetic energy that usually stopped the room, his face a mask of barely suppressed panic and possessive rage. He had heard what the Lucchese's were planning, and he had come to claim his role as the shield. Nia saw him the moment the bell chimed. She watched him scan the room until his eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that would have made any other woman melt or tremble. She didn't do either. She picked up a fresh pot of coffee and walked toward a booth in the corner, her expression as unreadable as a blank page. Dante stepped into her path, his broad frame blocking her route, his presence a wall of expensive wool and tattoos. "Nia, we need to go. Now," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating warning. She didn't stop. She didn't even look up. She simply pivoted, adjusting her stride to move around him with the same practiced ease she used to avoid a spilled drink on the floor. To Nia, he was no longer a force of nature or a king of the underworld. He was simply an interruption, a ghost from a story she had already decided to stop reading. She poured the coffee for a regular, her hand perfectly still, leaving Dante standing in the center of the room, invisible in the one place he mattered most. The night air around Nia's apartment building was too still, a heavy, synthetic silence that hummed with the threat of a coming storm. When she rounded the corner, 20 minutes ahead of the schedule the Lucchese's had likely calculated, she didn't keep walking. She stopped in the shadow of a brick alcove, her eyes narrowing as she spotted the dark sedan with tinted windows idling 2 doors down from her entrance. She didn't panic. She didn't feel the sudden urge to scream or run. Instead, her mind clicked into a cold, rhythmic gear, a survival instinct honed by years of watching for shadows. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. She didn't call Dante. To call him was to surrender the board, to invite the very chaos she was trying to outrun. Instead, she dialed the number she had memorized months ago as a final, desperate contingency Marco. 2 men. Black sedan. "My front door," she said, her voice a flat, steady wire. "I'm in the alley. If Dante is coming, tell him to stay in the car." By the time Dante's vehicle screeched to a halt at the curb 4 minutes later, Nia was already in motion. She hadn't waited to be rescued. She had used the time to move to the fire escape, positioning herself where she could see the entire street while remaining invisible. When Dante stepped out of his car, his face a mask of lethal, possessive fury, he didn't find a trembling girl trapped in a hallway. He found a woman who had already called the play. The confrontation with the 2 Lucchese men was a blur of efficiency. Dante handled the physical violence with a brutal, practiced grace, his knuckles connecting with bone in a way that would have terrified any other witness. But Nia didn't flinch. She watched from the shadows of the fire escape, her expression clinical, her hand gripping the iron railing with a terrifying steadiness. When the street was finally clear, and the Lucchese men were dragging themselves back to their car, Dante looked up. He expected to see relief. He expected to see the wall finally crumble, to have her fall into the safety he had fought so hard to provide. Instead, she climbed down the ladder and adjusted her coat, her eyes meeting his with a look that was entirely too calm. "You're late, Dante," she said, her voice echoing in the empty street. "I already told Marco where to send the cleaners." The violence of the night didn't shake him, but that sentence did. It broke something inside him that no rival family ever could. He realized in the cold light of the street lamps that he was never her savior. He was never the hero of this story. He was just another variable she had accounted for, a tool she had used because it was available, not because she needed it to survive. She had never been a prize to be won. She was an architect who had simply integrated his chaos into her own plan. He stood in the rain, watching her walk toward her door, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. The sirens never came. In this corner of the city, the air usually swallowed the sound of violence long before it could reach an official channel. The street simply resettled, the damp pavement holding the secret of the struggle like a stain that would eventually be washed away by the morning rain. Nia stood by the entrance of her building, her back against the brick. To any passerby, she looked like a woman waiting for a key, but Dante saw the way her fingers brushed against the fabric of her coat, a restless, micro-movement that betrayed a break in her rhythm. Her stillness, usually a fortress, was vibrating at a frequency only he seemed tuned to. Dante didn't move toward her. He stood by the open door of his car, the engine idling with a low, mechanical growl. He didn't issue a command. He didn't demand she get in, or tell her she was safe. He simply watched her, the lethal edge of his posture softening into something that looked dangerously like hesitation. "You should go inside," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the usual grit and dominance. It was a suggestion, not an order, a careful offering made by a man who had finally realized he was holding a bird that would rather die than be caged. Nia looked at him. She didn't turn away, and for the first time, she didn't look through him. She looked at the man beneath the suit, at the blood on his knuckles and the exhaustion in his eyes. She didn't shut him out with her usual clinical indifference. The door wasn't locked, but it wasn't open either. "I know," she replied. She didn't move. They remained there, suspended in the gray light of the pre-dawn street. The space between them was no longer the biting cold of mutual defiance, but it wasn't the warmth of a reconciliation. It was a fragile, breathless vacuum, a suspension of everything they thought they knew about each other. Dante felt the weight of it, a delicate tension that he knew he could break with a single wrong word or a sudden movement. For a man who had built an empire on calculated force, this fragility was terrifying. He didn't know how to navigate a space that didn't require his strength. And Nia, looking at the predator who had actually listened to her, didn't know how to maintain a wall against someone who had finally learned to stand still. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They just stayed there, caught in the wreckage of their own certainties, waiting for the first one of them to figure out how to breathe in the silence. The fragile silence between them in the pre-dawn gray didn't break all at once. It eroded. Nia's hand finally moved from the brick wall, but instead of retreating, she looked at the heavy duffel bag resting by her feet. The choice was made. The suspension had to end because the sun was rising, and with the light came the bus that would take Leo away from the shadow of the Greco name. "I have to get him out," she said, her voice finally finding its rhythm, though it was thinner than before. Dante didn't argue. He didn't offer his men or his cars this time. He simply followed her to the terminal in a quiet procession, his black sedan trailing her old hatchback like a dark sentinel. He kept his distance, honoring the boundary they had just discovered in the silence of the street. The dawn was a bruised purple over the bus terminal, the air tasting of exhaust and impending rain. Leo was pacing by the loading zone, his bag slung over a shoulder that looked too narrow for the weight he was carrying. Nia stood by the pillar, her eyes scanning the perimeter. She was back in her element, counting seconds, but the stillness was different now. It was no longer a cage, it was a vigil. It happened in the heartbeat between breaths. A rusted silver sedan drifted into the terminal lane, slowing with a deliberate, sickening grace. It wasn't a professional hit. It was a desperate act by a lower-level Lucchese soldier looking for a shortcut to a promotion. A messy, impatient mistake born from the signal Dante had sent days ago. The window rolled down, the dark barrel of a handgun emerging like a serpent's tongue. "Leo, down!" Dante's voice tore through the morning, but he was already moving before the sound left his throat. He didn't reach for his own weapon. He didn't calculate the tactical advantage. In that fragment of a second, the boss of the Greco syndicate vanished, replaced by the man who had stood motionless in the rain just to hear her breathe. He threw himself across the distance, his broad frame a wall of expensive wool and raw instinct. The shot was a dry, ugly pop. Dante slammed into Leo, his momentum carrying them both to the oil-stained concrete. The bullet, intended for the boy's chest, found the meat of Dante's shoulder instead. It was a sharp, searing graze, not a fatal blow, but a staggering reminder of the price of protection. The silver sedan vanished into the traffic, the screech of its getaway the only eulogy for the botched attempt. Then the silence returned, heavier and thicker than before. Dante stayed down for a moment, his breath coming in ragged stabs. He didn't check the perimeter. He didn't care if the car came back. He only felt her. Nia was on the ground beside him in an instant. Her hands, which had been so careful to avoid him for months, were suddenly everywhere, pressing against the heat blooming on his shoulder, her touch trembling with a violence she could no longer suppress. "Dante," she whispered, and for once, the name wasn't a rejection or a variable. He looked up, seeing the crack in the armor he had once tried to break with force. He didn't feel the triumph of a savior. He only felt the weight of her palms against his skin, the the first thing she had ever given him that wasn't born out of survival, but out of the fear of losing him. The safe house was a vault of shadows and expensive silence, far from the prying eyes of the Luccheses or the sirens of the city. No hospitals, no paper trails, no questions. In the dim, amber light of the kitchenette, the usual hierarchy of their world had finally collapsed. For the first time, Dante was not the architect of the moment. He was merely the man bleeding into a white towel. "Sit," Nia commanded. Her voice was low, stripped of its defensive edge, but replaced with a sharp, focused authority. Dante obeyed, settling onto a wooden chair, his eyes never leaving her face. "Don't move. Let me see it." She stepped into his space, her presence no longer an obstacle he had to navigate, but a gravity he couldn't escape. As she peeled back the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt, her fingers were steady, but the emotional detachment was gone. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, the slight tremor in her touch that wasn't born of fear, but of a devastatingly raw concern. She began to clean the grays, the scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint, lingering smell of gunpowder and her perfume. She was close, closer than she had ever been. He could see the individual lashes of her downward cast eyes and the way she bit her lip as she worked. Her fingers pressed firmly against his skin to stem the slow bleed, a touch that was both clinical and profoundly intimate. Dante didn't look at the wound. He watched the way the light caught the gold in her eyes and the way her breath hitched whenever he winced. This wasn't a performance. There was a current of feeling running beneath her stillness, a vulnerability she wasn't hiding fast enough. Carefully, slowly, Dante raised his good hand. He didn't reach for her to take or to command. He moved like a man approaching something wild and beautiful that might vanish if he breathed too hard. His fingers hovered near her jaw, an unvoiced question hanging in the air. Nia didn't pull away. That was the first answer. She looked up, and the space between them vanished, not through force, but through a shared, quiet gravity. Their foreheads almost touched, the air between them thick with everything they had spent months denying. Her breath shifted, becoming shallow and synchronized with his own. Then, Nia leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't the polished, dominant kiss of a woman who knew the script. It was uncertain, slightly desperate, and entirely real. A collision of months of no finally breaking under the weight of a single, undeniable yes. It was the sound of a fortress wall finally cracking. But just as quickly as the spark caught, she pulled back. She didn't retreat because the feeling wasn't there. She retreated because it was too much. She looked at him, her chest heaving, the armor sliding back into place with a jagged, painful speed. "This is how it starts," she whispered. The words weren't angry. They were a hollow echo of a ghost she had been running from her entire life. She stepped back, rebuilding the distance with shaking hands, her silhouette receding into the shadows. Dante sat in the silence, the sting of the wound nothing compared to the coldness of the room. They both knew it was real now, and in their world, that was the most dangerous truth of all. The drive back to the city was the longest of Dante's life. The steering wheel felt like cold iron beneath his palms, and the ghost of Nia's breath still haunted the hollow of his throat. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of the take, calculating leverage, exploiting weakness, and claiming territory. But in that safe house, in the shattering silence that followed her kiss, he had finally learned the weight of what cannot be seized. He could have had her. Not the version of her he had tried to collar with his name, or the version he had tried to buy with a receipt, but the woman herself. She had almost chosen him. She had leaned into the fire, and he was the one who had built the furnace that made her pull away. The realization didn't just sting, it broke him open, stripping away the boss of the Greco syndicate until there was nothing left but a man standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. 2 hours later, Dante sat in a windowless room in the back of a social club that smelled of stale cigars and ancient grudges. He sat across from the Lucchese leadership, but he hadn't brought the army Marco had suggested. He hadn't brought threats of a street war that would burn Manhattan to the ground. Instead, he laid a map on the scarred wooden table and pointed to the waterfront operation, the crown jewel of his empire, a logistics network he had spent 4 years of blood and brilliance building. "It's yours," Dante said. His voice was a flat, dead thing. "The shipping manifests, the unions, the kickbacks. All of it. Off the record." The Lucchese heads exchanged a look of predatory disbelief. "And in exchange?" "Nia and Leo Bennett," Dante said. "They are not under my protection. They are not my associates. They are ghosts. You don't see them, you don't speak to them, and you don't use them to get to me. They are formally outside the war. Permanently. It was a handshake deal, witnessed by two men who knew that to speak of it was to invite an immediate grave. Dante wasn't buying Nia's safety to keep her. He was buying her the right to never have to see him again. He was removing himself from her story, so she could finally stop fighting for air. He didn't tell her. He didn't tell anyone. When Marco cornered him in the office later, his face pale with the news of the concession, his voice was tight with confusion. You gave up the docs, Dante. For years of work. For what? You didn't even get a contract. You didn't get her. What did you get for yourself? Dante looked out at the city, at the thousands of lights that didn't care about his empire or his heart. He thought of the way Nia had looked when she whispered this is how it starts. Nothing, Dante said quietly. He finally understood the difference between a cage and a shield. He didn't get the girl, he didn't get the glory, and he didn't get to feel like a hero. He just got to be the man who let her go. And for the first time in his life, it was the only thing that felt like real power. The rain was a steady, rhythmic drumming against the roof of the Silver Spoon, a sound that felt as if the city were finally exhaling. Dante entered without his usual gravitational pull, his movements quiet, almost tentative. He didn't take his usual stool at the end of the bar. Instead, he stood before the counter and placed a plain manila folder on the linoleum. Inside was a lease agreement for a new apartment in the city where Vera lived, prepaid for 2 years in Leo's name, clear of any Greco or Lucchesi influence. He didn't present it as a solution or a receipt. He didn't even open it. He simply let it rest there between them. I tried to own you because I didn't know how to want something I couldn't have, Dante said, his voice low and stripped of its former artifice. He looked at her then, not as a predator or a protector, but as a man admitting defeat to his own nature. I still don't completely. But I know what I did to Leo was wrong, and I know you've been right about me longer than I was right about myself. There was no follow-up. He didn't wait for her to thank him, and he didn't wait for her to forgive him. He picked up the coffee Chloe had poured for him, left a tip that was reasonable, almost painfully ordinary, and walked out into the downpour. The bell chimed behind him, a lonely, final sound. Nia sat on a stool, the diner around her feeling suddenly vast and empty. She pulled the folder toward her, but she wasn't seeing the legal jargon or the signatures. She was thinking about Elena. She was thinking about the mother who had dissolved into a man's shadow, and the 16-year-old girl who had stood over that wreckage and made a vow like a blood oath. She realized then, with a sharp, cold clarity, that she had been keeping that vow like a punishment. She had spent a decade building a fortress of no, so committed to not becoming her mother that she had never stopped to ask what she actually wanted. She had performed fearlessness until the performance became her skin, convinced that stillness was her only weapon. But sitting there, in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, she had to admit the truth she had buried under years of survival. The fear she felt wasn't just about the danger Dante represented. It was about the way he made her feel like a person instead of a wall. She had been afraid because she knew, from the very first night at the gala, that he wasn't as simple as the monster she needed him to be. The story she had told herself to stay safe was crumbling, leaving her with a debt that was finally gone and a future that was, for the first time, terrifyingly hers to choose. The bell above the diner door rang once, a soft, tinny sound that was instantly swallowed by the hum of the city. Inside, the world remained unchanged. Orders were barked toward the kitchen, heavy plates slid across the counter, and the smell of burnt grease continued to hang in the air. Life moved on, indifferent to the fact that the woman who had been its most consistent ghost was finally walking out. Nia didn't stop for her coat. She didn't stop to think. The rain hit her the moment she cleared the threshold, a steady, soaking downpour that drenched her in seconds, chilling her skin and pinning her hair to her neck. She knew that if she paused, if she gave herself a single heartbeat to calculate the risk or weigh the vow she had kept for 10 years, she would turn back. She would retreat into the safety of her stillness and let the door lock behind her. Dante was exactly where she expected him to be. He was leaning against the car, one hand resting on the door handle, but he hadn't climbed inside. He wasn't pacing or checking the time with the restless impatience of a man used to being obeyed. He was just waiting. The effort it took for him to stand there, unmoving and uncommanding, was visible in the tight line of his shoulders. He saw her, and for a moment, the air seemed to leave him. He didn't move toward her. He didn't close the gap with his usual predatory grace. He stayed rooted to the asphalt, granting her the one thing he had always tried to take, the space to choose. That stillness, more than any of his grand gestures or paid debts, was what finally closed the distance. Nia walked up to him, the rain blurring her vision until she was standing directly in his light. He looked at her with a raw, piercing intensity, like he was trying to memorize a miracle he knew he didn't deserve to keep. "I was scared of you from the beginning," she said. Her voice was steady, but it wasn't empty. It carried the weight of every night she had spent staring at his shadow from behind a counter. The whole time, a pause stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof of the car. "I still am," she whispered. Dante nodded once. There was no defense in his eyes, no denial, no attempt to charm her out of her truth. He accepted it, the fear, the history, and the man he was. He stood there, exposed and silent, waiting for the judgment he expected. Nia took a step closer, intentionally entering the heat of his personal space. The gap between them felt alive, a humming wire of tension that had shifted from a threat to a bridge. "Ask me again," she said. He didn't hesitate this time, but the command was gone. He looked at her and understood the immense, staggering cost of her standing there in the rain. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a play for power. It was just the question, stripped of everything but the hope behind it. Nia didn't hide behind her mask. She didn't pretend she felt nothing. She looked at him fully, letting him see the fear that still lingered, but also the something else, the spark of desire and the terrifying decision to trust a man who had spent his life being untrustworthy. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet, nearly lost under the roar of the rain, but it landed with the force of a landslide. For a long second, neither of them moved. They were standing in a new world, one where the rules of the take and the refuse no longer applied. Dante reached for her then. He moved slowly, his hand traveling through the rain with a deliberate caution, giving her every millisecond to stop him. When she didn't, his palm came to rest against her wet cheek. His touch wasn't possessive, it was careful, as if he were still convinced she might shatter or vanish if he pressed too hard. Nia leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. That was the second answer. Their foreheads touched first, their breath mixing in the cold air, the rain running in rivulets between their faces. When the kiss finally happened, it wasn't the practiced, dominant display he had mastered over years of disposable nights. It started soft, a question, a test, a search for solid ground. She answered him by meeting him there, her own lips searching his with an honesty that broke the last of his defenses. The kiss deepened, not rushed or consuming, but felt in every nerve. Everything that had sat between them for months, the anger, the tension, the no she had used as a shield, and the yes he had tried to buy, unwound in that small space of warmth. His hand tightened slightly at her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her ear, while her fingers gripped the lapel of his coat. She wasn't delicate, she was real, her hands anchoring her to the moment. There was no performance left in her, no wall, no retreat. He pulled back just enough to look at her, needing to see that she was still there, still choosing this. She didn't step away. Instead, she was the one who closed the distance again, without hesitation. The second kiss was different, less questioning, more certain. His other hand found her waist, pulling her flush against him, not to own her, but because the distance no longer made sense. Her body answered the pull, yielding not out of weakness, but out of a shared hunger. The rain soaked them both to the bone, but the cold had vanished. For the first time, Dante wasn't taking. He wasn't leading or controlling the pace. He was simply in it, with her. And for the first time, Nia wasn't holding herself together. She was letting herself feel everything she had spent her life guarding against. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads remained pressed together, their breathing ragged and uneven. "You don't get to control this," she whispered against his lips. It wasn't a warning. It was the final boundary, the one he had to accept if they were going to survive each other. "I know," he answered. And this time, he meant it with every fiber of the man he was becoming. Nia studied him for one more second, searching his eyes for the ghost of the boss, finding only the man. Then she took his hand. She didn't wait for him to reach. She didn't wait for him to ask. She entwined her fingers with his because she wanted to. It was the first thing she had ever given him freely, and as they moved toward the car, it was the only thing that mattered. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and impossible choices, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping love stories just like this. And hey, turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next twist of passion and suspense.